In Genesis 7, God destroyed the world of the ungodly with a catastrophic flood. And in Genesis 8, the authors narrate how the flood ends by alluding to the opening chapters of Genesis, thus implying a new beginning for creation. Because of how great the sin of mankind was, the flood of Genesis was meant to be a do-over for creation, similar to how creation was inaugurated in Genesis 1. Several scholars of Genesis note there are several allusions to Genesis 1 that are found throughout Genesis 8, once again revealing unity across the chapters of Genesis. Both begin with watery chaos, and then there is a wind that acts upon the water. Then the dry land begins to appear, and then the birds of the air appear. And finally, mankind and the land animals appear as well. The text also emphasizes one family of animals coming out of the ark one after another, alluding to the created order. And there are also specific references to 7-day periods. Then there is also another reiteration to be fruitful and multiply, and that man has been called to be the image of God. In Genesis 8:22, God also pronounces the three fundamental functions of the cosmos in reverse order of Genesis 1, starting with agriculture, then weather, and then time. Once again, reiterating the focus of Genesis 1 was about the functions of the cosmos, not material creation. In Genesis 8, God has reestablished order over creation by specifying its functions, similar to the same theme we see in Genesis 1. The assurance that seed time and harvest, cold and heat, etc. will continue may also be an implicit polemic against pagan deities, like what might also be the case in Genesis 1. It is not the pagan deities that control and allow for the agricultural seasons to continue. It is the Lord who controls and runs these things and allows for seed time and harvest. Thus, Genesis 8 and the first part of Genesis 9 is a renewal of creation, and is written to echo Genesis 1 in detail. Questions arise as to why Noah released the birds that he did. Is the order and type of birds a theological message? Well, actually, this appears to be an ancient Near Eastern practice for surveying areas and finding land. Noah is using birds to survey the withdrawal of the floodwaters, and the account coheres with this ancient custom, even so in the order and type of birds released. In other words, releasing a raven first, and then a dove, is actually a practical thing to do in the ancient setting. As the IVP Bible Background Commentary says, unlike pigeons or doves, which will return after being released, a raven's use to the seamen is based on its line of flight. By noting the direction it chooses, a sailor may determine where land is located. The most sensible strategy is to release a raven first, and then use other birds to determine the depth of the water and the likelihood of a place to land. A raven, by habit, lives on carrion and would therefore have sufficient food available. The dove and the pigeon have a limited ability for sustained flight. Thus, navigators use them to determine the location of landing sites. As long as they return, no landing is in close range. The dove lives at lower elevations and requires plants for food. So Noah releasing a raven first and then a dove coheres with ancient seafaring customs. It is likely a raven would be released first to follow the line of direction to dry land. Since the raven didn't return, that would indicate it may have found a place to rest beyond the line of sight. The dove, which is a smaller bird, would have been released next to determine if land masses were nearby, which were not indicated right away. However, the second time the dove is released, it is said to have returned with an olive leaf. Olive trees do not grow at high levels of elevation, so this would indicate the ark came to rest in the region of the Aratu Mountains. It wasn't sitting at one of the highest peaks, waiting for the waters to subside. After all, verse 5 indicates the tops of the mountains could already be seen. But exact distances would have been impossible to determine, which is why birds were released. Shortly after, Noah opens the ark and allows animals out. Enough time has been given for the floodwaters to recede. And then what follows in the rest of Genesis 8 and parts of Genesis 9 as a new covenant is initiated. The first thing Noah does is build an altar and offer sacrifices, probably to indicate his gratitude for safely surviving the flood. This is the first time in Scripture it is directly said an altar was built for the Lord. Noah sacrifices several of the clean animals, and it is said that God smelled the pleasing aroma. In the other ancient Near Eastern flood accounts, this is done to literally provide a meal for the gods, which is why other foods, such as grain, are included. But it is nowhere indicated in the biblical texts that God requires sacrifices for nourishment. Instead, there is a biblical idiom of God smelling a pleasing aroma to indicate God is expressing favor towards a sacrifice, whereas the idiom of God refusing the smell indicates a rejection of a sacrifice or of the one making the sacrifice. By the authors noting God smelled the pleasing aroma, they are indicating the idea that God had accepted the sacrifice, and the effect it has reverses the conditions of God's heart that were seen in Genesis 6. Kenneth Mathews explains and notes the wordplay throughout the passage. Noah's worship soothed the broken heart of God, which had been injured by man's wickedness. Pleasing aroma is another sound allusion to the narrative's motif of rest in Noah. The translation, soothing aroma, best reflects the idea of rest or appeasement. Here we have several sound plays on the name Noah brought together. Through the soothing offering, God is brought to rest by Noah. Thus, by Noah, the divine grief regret over human creation and his decision to wipe out all humanity is transformed into his compassion for post-diluvian humanity. Because of this, God says he will never again curse the ground and directly destroy its inhabitants. Despite the way it seems, this is not a reversal of the curse placed on the ground in Genesis 3. Mathews notes the language is tied to Genesis 6:5 and reflects the punishment brought about through the flood. Simply put, God is promising not to impose any further afflictions on the ground because of humans. As we noted in our video on Genesis 3, cursing does not mean to put a hex on something, or for it to change physically. It is the opposite of the Hebrew word to bless, which means to put someone or something under God's protection or favor. So God is promising now to not step any further away from creation and allow disorder to ensue, like with the flood. Instead, order shall remain in seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. God promises order shall continue, and there will never be another special circumstance where the sin is so great that God has to send a catastrophic flood. What is included in this vow is the reminder that man is still sinful. In other words, God is not vowing these things because he believes humanity is no longer sinful. Mathews notes the Hebrew word for is better translated as even though. In other words, the text is basically saying that God will not destroy the land again, even though humans are still sinful and corrupt. However irregular the human heart is, the regularity of nature will continue, and God will allow order to persist from here on out. Humanity has been given a fresh start, but Genesis 8 indicates sin is still an issue. But God promises there will be no need to deal with it like with the special circumstance of the flood, because a new plan will soon begin, which will lead to redemption. Now that the darkest time of humanity is over, God's plan will begin to unfold, and instead of cursing, the text alludes to the fact that God will instead use one man to bless all the nations of the world. But before that happens, more must be done. God establishes a new covenant with Noah and all the animals of the earth, which is picked up in Genesis 9.